You're listening to Q4 Radio, q4.org, and 1680 AM, where we create beauty and defend it.
Welcome to Magick Radio Chicago's 116th show, broadcast live from Q4 Radio on today, October 14th of 2017. Hi, my name is DK Prince and I'm your host. And today, I want to talk about a dream and the depths that some will sink to for their own purposes, and how much further we still have to go as a culture to gain acceptance. Now, recently, I met with Juliana Soloviev, the proprietor of the Lady of Light, a New Age boutique. We discussed her childhood in Russia, her teens in the United States, her coming to embrace the magical arts, and starting her own business, as well as moving to Chicago and reopening that business, and the unfortunate, uncalculated series of events that will force her to move her boutique, and how these events will affect the long-term survival of every occult, New Age, and metaphysical service in the city. Today I am speaking with Juliana Soloviev. Thank you. And we're speaking from the Lady of Light, a New Age boutique. Welcome.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
So, for the benefit of our listeners, I just like to give them a little background on, who you are and where you're from. I suppose first, how did you get involved in all this?
This, and by this, I mean all this wonderful New Agey, pagan-y things that we're all engaged in.
That's right.
I've been in it all my life. I was actually born in Russia, in Moscow.
Oh, really? That far?
In the late 70s.
Oh, wow.
And it was still the communist era. And when I was a little girl, I used to see ghosts all the time. And it would scare me so much, and you couldn't talk about it, because during communism, if you saw ghosts, if you did any kind of occult anything, you were going to the mental asylum and you were not coming out.
I had heard about that.
So
the government would take people that they considered deviants or even political dissidents and put them in therapy for their own good, supposedly.
Right. And if you were put for your own good into one of those places, you're probably never going to come out. And if you did come out, you certainly would be mentally ill at that point, just from the drugs and everything they use. So in my family, all the women are psychic and intuitive, but none of them, it was always inside the family. It was not something we ever talked about. It was not something that we ever discussed out and about. And so when I was about 5 and I was seeing these ghosts and I didn't have anyone to talk to about it, I prayed and prayed and prayed to Mother Mary to make it go away. And so it did till I was about 15. And at that point I was in the United States. And one day I was coming off a school bus, just a normal old day. It was probably maybe April or May. I was coming down from the school bus and everything around me was breathing and living. Everything was beautiful. It had its vibration. Everything glowed. And in that moment, I knew I either went crazy or I needed to find a teacher. And as you know, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And that's kind of how it happened for me.
Where did you move to?
I moved to Seattle. So I was in Moscow till I was about 11. And then my mom and I came to the United States.
If I may ask, what year was that?
We moved here in 1991. Actually, it was Christmas night of 1991.
At the height of grunge?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Although, honestly, I had no idea what grunge was. I mean, I was still wearing your little sweaters and all that.
People would say that, yes, Seattle was pretty alive back then.
Absolutely. I didn't get to discover that until about mid-90s when I found our version of Broadway, which was also Broadway.
Okay.
So, and that's kind of where grunge lived, and that's where the metaphysical scene was, and that's where the alternative scene of all different kinds was. It's kind of like Boys Town, if you will.
Over here at the edge of Boys Town, our alternative scene was Clark and Belmont.
Ah, okay.
Back in the 80s, throughout the mid-90s, and a little further in, you'd see a lot of punks and new wave enthusiasts hanging out there. There used to be a lot of shops, including the Alley, as well as a teen nightclub called Medusa's, that just, you'd see people with all sorts of hair and makeup and leather all over the place. It was pretty awesome.
That's how our Broadway was in the 90s and early 2000s. A lot of underground goth clubs. We had a club called The Mercury that sounds a lot like your guys' Medusa. And then we had lots and lots of metaphysical shops that came and went around that area. The rents have skyrocketed since, so most of them are now gone. But during the heyday of it, it was definitely an exciting place to be if you were pagan or New Age or metaphysical.
And you were in your mid-teens, you said.
So I graduated high school in 1997.
Okay.
So I'm dating myself here, but So I was on that scene probably in the mid-90s, probably towards the end of my high school years, early college years.
Okay. Now, you said that you had met your teacher. What was the first thing that you started to learn when you embraced this art?
I asked the universe to send me someone that could help me to understand how to control these gifts and how to work with them so I didn't hurt myself or anyone else. And a friend of a friend of a friend kind of a situation recommended.
That's usually how it happens.
Yeah, exactly. And so I met a group of folks that were just forming an ancient Egyptian recreationist type of a pagan circle. And I joined them when I turned 18 officially. And they were a large part of my growth as a pagan and as a Wiccan during that period of time.
Because your first discipline was Wiccan then.
Yes, it wasn't probably as structured as you see some groups and folks.
Right. Some are more traditional, some are more modern, but yeah.
They were trying, so that particular group was trying to recreate the ancient Egyptian work, but it was at the beginning of that service or at the beginning of that program, if you will. So there was a lot of pieces they were trying to pull back from ancient Egypt, and there were pieces they were trying to incorporate from modern paganism and modern Wicca. And so it was probably a little bit of everything.
Now, what types of arts did you practice when you got fully initiated? Was there anything that you felt particularly drawn to, that you were really good at?
I've done a lot of things over the years. I've learned a lot of different disciplines. Tarot has always been close to my heart. That was probably the first type of divination that I learned during that period of time.
Which was your first deck?
Rider-Waite, and it's still my deck.
Of course.
It's still my deck. I still love that deck. That is still my favorite. Since then, I found Dali, which I love.
Is it the Salvador Dali deck?
Salvador Dali deck. The one that was like 1,200 copies. They were printed in Spain, and they're really hard to find. But I have one of them. I'm lucky enough to have one of them, and I adore it. The only problem is, one in the past, when I used to do professional readings in Seattle all the time, the only deck I ever used was Rider-Waite. So I guess I'm a purist that way. But actually, the very first type of divination I learned was from my grandma, and it was the regular cards, like playing cards. She taught me how to use those because, of course, in Russia you didn't have tarot decks at that point.
That's true. A lot of your more experienced readers are aware that poker playing cards are actually based on the same scheme as your tarot decks, just
Absolutely.
Without the major arcana.
Mm-hmm.
It's
and
just
you can
suits.
substitute if you need to. There's ways you can substitute other cards from other decks into it if you have more than one deck of the same kind.
Really? I didn't know about a substitution. How's that work?
So basically you take certain decks and you just draw on them. Like you can create your own high arcana if you want, or whatever you want.
I suppose.
And you can just add it into the deck. It does. It can if you want to. And that makes it really, really personalized too. That's one of the ways you can kind of work it if you have to.
Now, you did this all throughout college?
I learned all the way from high school and till basically the end of my college years. Honestly, at the time I was going for a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, and I swear I spent more time learning occult sciences than I ever did college work. So thankfully I was lucky enough to graduate in one piece, but it was like getting 2 degrees at the same time.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before.
And in some ways it's not that different. A lot of what we see in magical work, a lot of what we see in shadow work, a lot of what we see in tarot work, almost any occult discipline really, it has roots in psychology and vice versa. A lot of things that I learned about archetypes were applicable both in psychology and in tarot, for example. I use those all the time.
And the symbolism is deeply psychological.
Absolutely. And then you learn about Freud and you learn about Jung. And
as I understand it, Jung was a big proponent of mystical arts.
Yes, especially in a sense of kind of delving into the subconscious. So, and that's obviously applicable.
Yeah, I think that's where him and Freud started to butt heads a little.
Well, and Freud kind of got a little stranger towards the end of his life. That's kind of my understanding. He got a little interesting.
Yeah.
So that probably also helped with the...
That's probably true. Now, as I understand it, you mentioned to me before that you had a shop back in Seattle.
We did. So actually, we started, my partner and I, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit, but we started a long time ago, and we started with half a table at the Body, Mind, Spirit Expo in
Oh, you were a vendor.
Yes, in Portland, and that's how our
Okay.
shop started years and years and years ago now. And from half a table that I just had to do it. I've always wanted to do this kind of thing, and at the time that was all I could do. And that's how it started, and it's basically grown over the last 10 plus years to a point where we had a shop in Seattle. If you guys know where Tacoma is, it's about 45 minutes south of Seattle. And we had a cute shop called the Inner Goddess, and it was right in the theater district, if anybody knows where that is.
In the theater district.
That
sounds like fun.
Yes, it's the antique district and the theater district. Basically, there's some beautiful, beautiful old vintage buildings in Tacoma that
Sounds like a perfect place to set up a shop like that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And there were a lot of vintage and antique dealers in that area, and at least, well, vintage and antique things are close to my heart, so I think a lot of our customers were their customers and vice versa.
Now, how long did that last?
We had a shop there for about 2 years. We were lucky enough to have space there so that we could hold psychic fairs and classes and do a lot more of that. Cause
you held psychic fairs?
Absolutely.
Cool.
We had psychic fairs, and we had lots of amazing psychics and intuitives. And
reminds me of a joke. What did the psychic say to his friends on the way to the psychic fair?
What?
We're going to have a great time.
That's a good joke.
Ba-dum-bum. There we go.
I like it. It's a good joke.
Okay. So you were saying though.
Yes.
So you held fairs.
Yes, we held fairs. One of the biggest parties in Tacoma actually was the New Year's night, and they had a huge, big bunch of festivities there. There was all sorts of vendors of different kinds, food vendors and the circus performers and all sorts of things. And we had a fair all through the night until about 1:00 in the morning every New Year's night, and that was really amazing.
Sounded like a really magical atmosphere.
It was, and it was a great big party. And it was fantastic. So I kind of missed that.
Yeah.
In Chicago, we have a smaller space. So it's well packed, but it's a little bit smaller. Real estate's a little expensive here.
How many years was the shop open?
So our Tacoma shop was about 2 years there with its physical roots in the ground. And what brought us to Chicago was my spouse got a job out here. And so we picked everything up and we just brought it straight over here and found the spot in East Lakeview in Chicago. And
now,
here we are.
Was it difficult to start all over again? Did you have to get a new license and all
well,
sorts of
every
other...
time you move states, you have to create everything from your legal paperwork and get a new license from the city. Every time you move it from a city to a city, you have to get a new license. So yes, absolutely. We came here, we changed the name of the store because we had to refile all the licensing requirements. And we also had to get a city license as well.
See, and there's a lot involved in that, I assume.
It's a fair bit, yes. If you can do it yourself, that's awesome. Most people have to hire attorneys to do it. It can be complicated. And in some states, you can transfer your LLC from state to state, but Illinois is not one of the states that at least accepts those licensing from other states. At least not from Washington State. I'm perhaps maybe not from any state, but...
So what exactly is involved if somebody out there wanted to start a psychic-oriented or New Age-oriented business here in Chicago?
It's actually quite complicated. So first things first, somebody would have to establish, if they're going to have a limited liability company, and that is always the better way to go than a sole proprietorship or partnership, because it gives you some extra levels of legal protection in case you get sued. But that would be the first thing to do. So you would have to establish that with the state, on the state level. Now, in Illinois, it's very interesting because you have to have a license, as far as I understand anyway, at the state, the county, and the city level at least. And they're probably going to require you to file something with the IRS as well, because they want to make sure the taxes get paid appropriately.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah.
So you have to, if I remember correctly, you have to get the EIN number, which I believe is through the federal government. So you establish your LLC, you get your EIN number, and then you have to go through, once you have that, you have to go through and apply for a license at the county level, and then you go through and apply for a license on the city level. Well, all of these, of course, require fees as well as a lot of paperwork. And eventually you get all those papers together. It usually takes sometimes a month, sometimes more, sometimes several months, depending on whether you pay the expedited fees or not. eventually you get to the city business license level, and that's where things get really complicated in this city. So, for example, in Washington,
Chicago.
yes. So in Washington State, if you apply for a city business license in the city of Seattle or Tacoma for that matter, it's actually a lot simpler. You go online, you find the 1-page or maybe 2-page application. It gives you all the categories for the kind of businesses that they have. You click them, one or more of them. You sign your paperwork, you pay your 100 or 150 or whatever it is that they ask for, and you're done. They send you the business license within 2 weeks. In Illinois, in Chicago, not quite like that. So here you have to go in person to an office at the city hall. It's called the Small Business Administration. You have to sit in line for a fair bit until they get to you. And then you go and talk to a person who is trained to assess the kind of business you're going to want to have and the requirements that you're going to need. Now, in order for you to do this, you have to have a piece of real estate that you've already more or less secured. Because
so you'd have to set up the
have
rental
to
space already.
Not set it up, but you have to, basically the only way they're going to talk to you is if you have an actual address that you already specifically are asking about. So it can't be theoretical conversation about some space in Chicago. It has to be a specific space. Why? Because the zoning in Chicago, again, from my understanding, is completely dependent on the physical location of your store space. So for example, if I moved a block down from my current store space, I would have to go through that process all over again from the beginning. Now, once you get in there, you talk to somebody, and hopefully they know what a New Age store is. The person that I talked to did not. So they ask you questions like, what are you going to be doing? Well, if you don't know in great detail what you're going to be doing, or if you don't know what is relevant, there's really no way that I'm aware of that you can answer that question correctly. So they will ask you what they know, the questions that they know to ask. Now, since a lot of people are not really familiar with the New Age or pagan or metaphysical industry, they don't know what specific questions are applicable. And so unless you somehow know what they're what information they're asking you for, it can be quite challenging to figure out what information you actually need to give them. So that's kind of confusing. And there's no, like in Seattle, there was a sheet of information. You just picked out the right category. In this situation, they don't give you anything like that. So you don't know what the categories are, and you don't really know what specific, where you would fall with different business activities you might have. So now once you tell them the kind of business that you have and what you're going to be doing, they will either approve or disapprove you and tell you whether or not you can have that kind of business in that location, if you're zoned for it, if you have any kind of signage on your business doors or windows, or if you have awnings, they will take a look at that too, if you're allowed to have those kinds of things or not, or what the sizes are or whatever. We didn't have a lot of that, so I don't know in great detail how that works. But if you have a restaurant, they want to know if you can have a sidewalk seating or something like that. So there's lots of rules that go into that. And then basically, if they say okay, then they give you a business license, which then you're required to hang somewhere in your space where it's easily viewable and accessible. So usually behind the register, more or less. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what's involved.
Now, did you have to basically make a list with bullet points about all the different services that your shop would provide?
I didn't have to submit anything to them. They didn't ask for anything. I do remember filling out like the address, and I remember filling out an application that had like the business name and things like that. But usually it's a conversation. They're writing things down. They're making notes about what you're going to be doing. So it basically is like being interviewed.
Okay. Now, you went through this whole process, and about how long did it take altogether, would you say?
I think it took me about 2 months from the beginning to end.
Just 2 months of constant work.
2 months of research and applying for things and paying fees and so on. All that kind of thing. So,
all that fun stuff.
Yeah, all of that fun stuff. I mean, and I don't know that that's completely atypical for this state. I know in Washington it was a lot faster. But here, a lot of it has to be more manual. So you have to actually be like physically present, for example, for this for the city portion of that.
Now, if I recall correctly, you went through all this and you finally opened your lovely shop in, what was it, June of 2015?
We opened we opened right at the end of May, so almost to June of last year.
Okay. And you've been open here ever since.
We've been open here ever since. It's been really awesome to be here. And I met some amazing people here.
You're right in the heart of Voyagetown.
We are, and we're right in East Lakeview. We're on Broadway, so there's lots of restaurants and lots of fun things.
You're just a skip away from the lake.
Yes, literally one block.
And that's for many of us who practice the occult arts and certain metaphysical things, and just being here in Chicago, like that's a source of immense strength.
There's something amazing going on in the lake. So that's something I noticed right away when I got here. And that's part of the reason I wanted to be by the water is I keep seeing a vortex that's above the water. There's like an energy, something going on out there.
Trust me, this city has mojo going on. There's no doubt about it. There's a very unique vibe that only this city has. And
that's for
sure. Lake, a big part of it is the fact that we are so close we're right on the lake. There's something about that does something to this city.
Absolutely. And it's also a Pisces city. So if you look at the date of incorporation, it's actually incorporated during the Pisces energy.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I always do. I look like, for example, Seattle's a Scorpio city. So anyway, so Chicago is so well suited for any kind of spiritual and metaphysical work, New Age work, because it's already naturally inclined in that way. But this is also why I think there's a lot of divisions here too, because Pisces, two fish going in opposite directions. So you always kind of have the up and the down.
I never even thought of that.
Yeah.
On that note, let's just take a quick musical break. And when we come back, we'll continue this discussion with Juliana Soljub from the Lady of Light New Age Boutique. And you are listening to Magick Radio Chicago, streaming live from 1680 a.m. and Q4.org, the station that creates beauty and defends it with magic. And we're back, and you're listening to Magick Radio Chicago, streaming live from 1680 a.m. and Q4.org, the station that creates beauty and defends it. I'm here talking with my friend Juliana, the proprietor of the Lady of Light, a New Age boutique. And, well, Juliana, so we were in part of the discussion where you were telling me how you finally went through all these hoops and finally opened your shop.
That's right. So we opened the shop at the end of May, beginning of June of last year. And we've had a lot of fun here for about a year. And then two things happened. One, I was participating in a fair, and so we were gone for over the weekend. And when I got back from participating at the fair, I found a cease and desist letter from the city underneath my door of my shop.
Now, when did this happen? Around what time?
This happened at the end of May of 2017. So it happened basically right at the beginning of summer. And the cease and desist letter specifically said that they had observed me doing a reading for someone, and that
what kind of reading?
An intuitive reading. They called it a spiritual reading, and that the city was forbidding me from having any kind of spiritual readings here at the store because we were not zoned for it.
Any kind of spiritual readings?
Any kind of spiritual readings. And subsequently, when I went to the city to find out what this was about, because of course this was a complete surprise to me, I found out from the city that because of the way the zoning is in this city, we were not allowed to do any kind of classes or readings that had to do anything with astrology, numerology, or anything else that they considered to be spiritual, quote unquote.
That's a pretty broad category.
It is a very broad category. And the reason that it is a very broad category is because the city of Chicago has a very old zoning description that basically says astrology, tarot, card readings, palmistry, and such. So basically, based on that ordinance, they can put anything, spiritual, metaphysical, pagan, under the definition of that category and forbid you from doing it the city of Chicago.
And that could apply to so many different types of magical disciplines.
Absolutely. Basically, almost anything that has to do with occult or paganism can be fit under that description as far as I can tell. Now, because this category is so broad and potentially so vague, nobody really can know for sure until they get a cease and desist letter from the city that their particular activity is specifically forbidden by that ordinance. But that also means the city can pretty much decide that anything does fit under that category and send somebody a cease and desist letter, assess them fines, etc., etc., etc.
Now, did this have anything to do with your business, the size of your business, or having the required permits?
Since I already had a retail permit for my space, it certainly wasn't like I wasn't licensed. It didn't have anything to do with the size of my business, as far as I know, as far as I understand. It simply had to do with the fact that the city apparently considered spiritual readings to be a separate category, and anyone who was engaging in them would fall under that category. So this would apply to, theoretically, to, anybody doing palmistry or tarot readings or intuitive readings or spiritual readings, or really any kind of reading, anything the city considers to be, as it turns out, probably unsavory.
Now, if I ask, what made them target you?
Good question.
There's a lot of stores
Absolutely.
and a lot of storefronts that have these types of services.
Right, and I think this is the really bad news. So somebody, I didn't know this for a long time. So I guess I should start with this. The city had me go to a hearing and pay a fine. Until I went to the hearing, I didn't have any information about what happened.
So you had to go to the city and pay a fine.
I had to go to the court, hire an attorney for a business because it's a requirement of city law.
And you had to go through all this and not even know what you're in trouble for.
Exactly, because nobody would actually tell me, or nobody had the information. I still don't have most of that information. What I do know is that the city attorney told my attorney at the hearing that somebody from our own community called, not just on me, but on several of the stores in the area, and reported them for doing readings without the right zoning permit.
So this isn't necessarily a Starbucks or some other kind of business that wants your store space.
I think that's unlikely. It very much sounds like this is a competitor, probably somebody who is somehow engaging in doing readings or having a storefront, or somebody who probably engages in classes or spiritual readings themselves.
So somebody had a vested interest in weeding out the competition.
That's what it sounds like, and that's kind of the implication that I heard. Well, I've seen all sorts of things that people do to each other in this industry and other industries too. I've never seen anyone go to this length. I got to
tell you, I'm not a businessman myself. I've been floating around this scene for well over 27 years, and I got to tell you, I've never heard of this.
I've never heard of this either.
This is probably one of the most cowardly things I've ever heard.
And not just that, but, unless you have a business, perhaps it's hard to see, but when you open a business, you put your entire livelihood, your heart and soul, and your money and your reputation on the line.
And just tons of hard work.
Absolutely. And all the love and all the care that you put into it. For me, this is my life. For somebody to call like that, and to basically try to weed out the competition by going through these means was just completely without heart. And like I said, it wasn't just on us. This was actually done to several places in the area. I think I'm probably the most outspoken about it, because I think this is so wrong, and also because I'm concerned about how this really impacts not just the pagan businesses in the area, but honestly everybody, all the readers, all the small businesses, and even just the pagan community in general, since readings are such a big part of our community.
I honestly, without trying to call out anybody, I've always seen this as a regular staple in this life, where people have a pagan business of some sort, or an occult-oriented or metaphysical or New Age-oriented business, and they would routinely have classes, or they'd bring in a reader to do services for their customers.
Absolutely.
That's a fairly common thing.
Well, and this is what I learned about the zoning practices in the so let me backtrack. Most of these ordinances that ban, they call them crafty sciences. So basically metaphysical sciences.
They call them
crafty sciences. So basically the idea being is, so anything that has to do with readings or astrology or whatever. So Most of these ordinances go back to the assumption that any kind of psychic or intuitive or spiritual reading is basically fraudulent. That's where it starts. So if you look back to the laws of early 1900s, and these laws have been basically litigated from like 1911 on. So it was various levels of success. But basically, it starts from the assumption that you can't tell the future and therefore it's fraud. And so some cities still buy into that, and some city officials, sometimes because of religious discrimination as well, they buy into that idea, and so they create these ordinances and bans in order to try to protect the consumers from these horrible, psychics and fortune tellers who are defrauding them.
Now, that would be some irony if this whistleblower actually put themselves in the hot plate as well, because they might fall under that same category.
Well, since the city never disclosed to me who that was, I have no idea, but that is entirely possible.
I mean, I'm thinking if the city's going after people who perform these services, then whoever was trying to eliminate the competition, if that's the kind of business that they're in, they might be targeted next.
They might have started a wave they can't control. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So what's happened is in 1985, there was a very famous case in California. It was called Spiritual Psychic Services Church of Truth versus City of Azusa, where basically the Supreme Court of California said you can't ban this sort of psychic readings, spiritual readings, because it's against the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And so things have been changing slowly, but they just haven't changed everywhere yet. And these ordinances have been being challenged all over the country. It's just here the city appears to be using zoning as a way to zone out these kinds of businesses out of the city. The only place you can do psychic or spiritual readings or classes, apparently, by right, is a small area by downtown Chicago, about what you guys call them the Loop. I still call it downtown. But basically right on the other side of the freeway. There's a small area. It's an expensive area. It's not a very nice area. That's where you can do it by right, where you just go to the city and the city rubber stamps it and says, it's okay, you can do it here. Everywhere else in the city, you have to have a special use permit if that area even allows a special use permit.
And I'm pretty sure this doesn't apply to, let's say, the Christian Science reading rooms.
I would be surprised, honestly. I would expect that it probably doesn't apply. This is specific to the astrology and the like, basically, for the category that they have. Now, most categories, if you look at the zoning ordinance for the city, most areas or most types of businesses are allowed more than one area where they're allowed by right. Because here's the problem with getting a special use permit. If you want to get a special use permit, you have to pay up front $1,025 just up front, just to have them hear your case. You have to submit a ton of paperwork that you probably have to hire specialists to create for you, attorneys, architects, etc. You have to go to everybody within 250 square feet from your business and ask them. Basically, you have to give them notification you're asking for this permit. And they have a say whether or not you're going to get this permit. Then the city hears your case about 4 months after you file it or more. That's what I was told by the business administration. And then they eventually they give you a decision, yay or nay. So you could spend all that time, all that work, all that expense, and you can still get a big no. And then what do you do? And how many landlords are going to wait for 4 months while you go through this process? So by basically making this process so difficult to go through and these permits to obtain, virtually the city is zoning out this kind of practice from the city of Chicago.
And within the boundaries of the Loop, it's accepted as long as they can pay their fees.
It's a small area right outside of the Loop. It's basically on the other side of the freeway of the Loop. In that area, you can literally just walk into the office, a business administration. If your address is in that area, they will theoretically, at least, I haven't tried obviously, but they theoretically will give you the permit to do it there basically just by right.
Now, so far in your experience and what your lawyer has explained to you and from your research, this applies to tarot readers, chakra readers, astrologers, perhaps?
Absolutely, astrologers. That's the first one in the category.
Okay. And then
certainly tarot readers, astrologers, and I think it says palmistry as well.
Palmistry.
But then they say and such. And such means anybody really they want to put in that category.
Now, one thing that leaps to my mind is that in this city, as well as many other places, there's a big boom in Reiki healers. Do you think this applies to them as well?
Absolutely. I think even though Reiki is not specifically enumerated there, when I ask questions about what kind of classes I could and couldn't teach, anything that I named that had to do with paganism, New Age, metaphysics, or the occult, they said it was under that category and I couldn't do it.
Like, besides Reiki, is there any other that you'd
Yeah, so
mention?
I asked about numerology, I asked about astrology, I asked about tarot, I asked about meditation.
Meditation.
I asked about chakras.
Because meditation is that's
correct.
That's an incredibly
That's
gray
correct.
area for them to try
That's
to
correct.
police.
Exactly. However, the city took the stance that anything that has to do with those kinds of things.
If that's the case, they can close down the Buddhist temples.
I don't know if they're protected under some kind of other
they
doctrine.
They
but
would be considered. They are considered a religious institution, no doubt. But I mean, Buddhism is definitely part and parcel with their system of belief and their practice.
I don't know. It's possible. I mean, I don't know if they would consider that to be a church, because I know church is a separate category with its own complicated rules. But
Well,
at least
temples are administrated under the same rules as a church.
Then that would make sense, yeah. However, if they did classes, I don't know how that would be seen by the city. Theoretically, I suppose even they.
I just saw ads on Facebook for transcendental meditation classes.
Right, and you see that all the time. And as you know, I asked the business administrator, basically, I asked like, okay, Hobby Lobby, right? They do classes, or is that okay? And she was like, well, no, it's not. So the city of Chicago really wants to be involved in absolutely micromanaging everything you do. And at least my experience has been, if it has anything to do with New Age, the answer is no.
This turn of events is alarming enough, but now that you say that they're actually trying to crack down on places that teach meditation, there's a lot of yoga studios in this city. And the thing is that, people who know yoga know that it's not just exercise, it's actually a form of meditation. It's a form of physical meditation.
Correct.
And this would also fall under this category?
I don't know. But it does, certainly if meditation is not okay for me to teach, then I don't see why it would be for a yoga studio either.
I could be wrong on this, but I believe that a lot of these studios are kind of run as the same way as a gym.
Right.
But yoga itself, the practice itself, is known as an ancient physical meditative art.
That's correct. Honestly, when you go and talk to the business administration, you're talking to a human being, an individual that's trying to interpret ordinances and laws. I know I've gone more than once and I've talked to different people, and in some small things they had different answers that contradicted each other because they're not going off a script necessarily. However, these kinds of bigger questions like classes, readings, and so on and so forth, they were pretty clear that the only way I could possibly do that in the city of Chicago outside of that small area was to get a special use permit, which is basically near impossible to actually achieve. When I talked to my nearby Chamber of Commerce, they basically said people have been disproved before. It's unlikely I would ever be able to get it out here, at least in this neighborhood.
That's a shame. Now, did your lawyer have anything helpful to add to this?
Sadly, no. Like a lot of attorneys in the city, I don't know that anybody knows a lot about this industry, and therefore they're not always prepared to answer a lot of questions. However, now that I've said that, if somebody does know a fantastic lawyer that is used to working with ordinances in Chicago, I would love to hear from you. Please let me know. My email is theinnergoddess@yahoo.com, and I would love to meet them and ask them some questions. I feel like certainly if there's any legal advice out there that could be gotten, I think would be very helpful at this stage.
Oh, we're definitely going to be networking this. This might be the first interview on this topic, but it's going to be far from the last.
Well, and that's the thing. So in other parts of the country, these zoning bans, but even where the city tries to unreasonably zone a certain activity out of the city, because it potentially infringes on the First Amendment and the First Amendment rights, these ordinances have been challenged successfully in court. So if we wanted to band together and find a fantastic lawyer who wants to basically challenge this issue at court, there's a good chance that this would be a victorious issue.
Possibly. Now, the thing is, the pagan scene socially has been, criticized largely from within, actually. Basically, it's very separate. A lot of stores and a lot of groups don't wish to work with each other, but I do think that this could be a unifying factor because this applies to everybody across the board.
Absolutely.
I can foresee a very large number of businesses and even groups that I'm aware of, and I'm not even aware of every one that's out there. I can foresee many of them losing their livelihoods due to this.
Well, and that's the thing. So it's possible that. So I know that at least one of the other shops that was impacted by this issue has been in business in Chicago for many, many years. I don't want to out them, so I'm not gonna say their name, but this is affecting people. And I just heard of another shop it sounds, based on their behavior, it sounds like they might have been affected by it too. I know that it's
like they're just holding back on their services.
Yeah, they're changing what they're doing. This is what I'm hearing from my customers, is that they're changing what they're doing. So it sounds like there may be a person amongst us who's made a mission out of this. And so if you are a business in the Chicago area and you're engaging in this kind of practice and you haven't gone through all the legalities with the city about it, just please be aware that this could very much be impacting you. And if you haven't gotten legal advice on this, then this might be a good time to do so.
Well, on that note, let's just take a quick break. And when we come back, we will continue this discussion. And you are listening to Magick Radio Chicago, streaming live from 1680 AM and Q4.org, the station that creates beauty and defends it. And we're back. You are listening to Magick Radio Chicago, streaming live from 1680 AM and Q4.org, the station that creates beauty and defends it. Today I am talking with Juliana from the Lady of Light, a New Age boutique, and we're discussing a very concerning topic that will involve eventually every New Age, occult, and psychic practitioner in the entire city, except for maybe a small area right outside the loop. Okay, Juliana, welcome back.
Thank you.
Now, for the benefit of our listeners, would you be willing to discuss, just itemize perhaps, the steps that the city has taken against you and your shop so far?
So these are the things to look out for. I believe, and none of this was disclosed to me, so I'm piecing this together from the events that happened in a few months before we received the cease and desist letter. I believe, based on the date that was on the cease and desist letter, that the investigator for the city actually called and asked me on the phone about my rates. I believe that was the occurrence that they were referring to as the violation of my business license. And so...
a police investigator called you.
Well, I don't think it was a police investigator. I think it was a city administration investigator, which may or may not be the same thing. I'm just not sure how the city is organized on that end. So from what I understand, I believe I received a phone call from somebody who pretended to be a customer, who asked for my rates. And then the moment I announced the rates, they sent me the cease and desist letter. Now, please understand that the cease and desist letter, just from that, states that they can charge you per violation between $200 and $500.
$200 to $500
yes. So basically,
each time.
That's right. The moment I voiced my rates, they charged me a certain amount of money. Now, if you break the cease and desist letter, the letter actually says that they can charge you between $500 and $1,000 per violation plus jail time. So
plus jail.
That's correct. So basically, if you break the cease and desist requirements, you are in a heck of a lot of trouble. I mean, there's no warning. There is no, ma'am, you made a mistake. There's none of that stuff. They go for the throat immediately. So, and then when I came back from my vacation, the day after I received my cease and desist letter, I believe I had an investigator in my store, possibly the same investigator.
Really?
He did not identify himself. He came in and asked me questions about readings and class. Well, no, he didn't ask me about classes. He asked me about readings. He asked me all sorts of interesting questions, leading questions that sounded like entrapment. And that's what keyed me off that something was wrong. And I recognized his voice after that.
What kind of questions did he ask you?
So one of the things he asked me was if I could do readings from home.
home.
From home, that's right. Since I said I couldn't
This
do
guy
them
could
from
be a
the
serial
store.
killer for all you know. Why would you do it at home?
Exactly. Or if I would be willing to do it over the phone. I said no to both because I honestly, I didn't. Nobody told me I couldn't, but I kind of assumed that this probably meant I couldn't do it at all in any way. So, and it was a good thing I did say that, and I did mean that, because down the line, one of my customers said he had talked to the city about this since I brought this up to him when we were talking about it. And he said, in the city of Chicago, you may not do readings from home at all. And if you do, you're in a lot of trouble if you get caught. It's actually because you can't get a business license in your home for this kind of work. Psychic work is not allowed from home at all.
Now, there are a lot of independent practitioners
I know
out there.
there are. Of course they are, just like they are all over the country. But in the city of Chicago, it is my understanding that you may not do readings from home legally at all.
That's going to really ruffle a lot of feathers.
So folks out there, keep that in mind. I know this comes as a surprise because honestly, until this happened to me, I've been in this industry for the last 26 years and I have never heard of anything like this.
Now, were there any other kind of leading questions that set up any red
another
flags?
Question that he asked me that was specifically concerning to me, he really, really wanted to know if I knew anybody else in the city of Chicago who did readings.
He was asking you to name names.
Absolutely. He was not only asking me to name names, but he was pressing pretty hard for me to name names. Just so you all know, I didn't name anybody. Mostly, I don't know anybody, but besides that, of course, this is not a question you answer.
I don't
for
want
lots
to.
of reasons.
Yeah, I don't want to press, but just for our listeners, if you could explain just like what do you mean he was pressing pretty hard?
He kept asking me if I knew anybody that did readings, if there was any shops around, if there's any places around. Where would I go if I needed one? Questions like that. He asked me maybe 3 or 4 questions on that, and he was really waiting for those answers.
So even after the first time,
yes, even after I said I don't know, he just kind of
kept pressing the issue.
He kept pressing the issue, and he did a lot of uncomfortable silences around that issue. He really
was
wanted
it glaring at you at all?
He kind of was looking very, very carefully at me and waiting for my response and reading my body language. And then he looked around. We have a little networking windowsill where, I've in the past allowed folks, and I welcome people to actually network. So, we have lots of flyers and things like that from all sorts of different people. Sure, of course, because that's part of our mission is to network and bring enlightenment to people by way of lots and lots of different practitioners. So he took a look at that and ended up taking one of the little magazines and flipped through it. It looked to me like he was looking for advertisements, but he took it with him, so I don't know what he did with it.
There are a lot of New Age periodicals that have readers take out ads.
That's correct. So it is my understanding, based on reading some of the legal research that I've been reading over the last few months, is that if you advertise it, you're advertising, that could be a violation in itself. Don't quote me on it. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that it's the same thing.
And if he is a policeman, he's got to identify himself. Otherwise, it's entrapment.
Well, no one identified. And he did not look like one of typical people that come into my shop, whatever that means. And his questions were definitely suspicious, especially considering the timing.
It does seem like if he just kept asking you the same things over and over again, it seemed kind of relentless.
He wasn't asking the same question over and over again, but he certainly was asking lots of questions and pressing and waiting for those answers. So I certainly felt like he was really trying to get the information. They weren't rhetorical and they weren't lighthearted.
And was he trying to get information about which readers you might know of that operate out of their own homes?
He asked me if I knew anyone in the city who did psychic readings and where I would go to get one here. So he asked me if I was willing to do it from home. He didn't specifically ask me if other people did it from home, but he did ask me where people did readings and who would be able to do a reading for him. Which I suppose in some ways maybe is the same thing. Maybe. So, and again, on a cease and desist letter, it was there was a name that went with that from the city administration, and so this individual, I don't know if he was a policeman or if he was from the city administration. Like I said, he pretended to be a customer, so he never identified himself as anything else.
What did you do after this person had pretty much grilled you?
After this person pretty much grilled me, I went back to the city and to the city administration, and attempted to get more information about what I could and couldn't do, which was very limited information at that point. And so a month later, I went to a hearing and paid a fine. And of course, we don't engage in readings, classes, or anything else at this point. And we're hoping down the line, if we're able to move outside of the city of Chicago, then we can hopefully start doing classes and readings again, if that city allows it. However, in a city of Chicago, obviously they kind of discourage that. So basically, the effect that it's causing from these regulations is that businesses like mine are going to have to move outside of the Chicago in order to pursue the activities that they're supposed to be, that they want to be pursuing, and the activities that comprise a good portion of New Age businesses in general.
Now, if I may ask, a little earlier we touched on that area just outside the loop where it is allowed.
Yeah, it's called the downtown service. If you look on the zoning map for the city of Chicago, it's called the downtown service area, which is basically, if you look at the loop, and the loop is by the water, and there's a freeway on the west side of the loop. It's right on the other side of that. So from driving through it, I can tell you it's kind of not as nice of an area perhaps, and certainly more industrial. However, the rents there are fairly high because it is so close to the loop. So basically, this would be I think the most difficult area to have a successful business in, which I think is kind of the point. Let me put it this way. One of the individuals that I talked to about this, not in Chicago city office, but in another administrative office, basically said, well, psychic activities or spiritual readings are basically like, they should be regulated, and they kind of should be really regulated like a red light district. So basically they're
comparing it to
they're seeing it to basically other businesses that lack virtue in some way. So or
attract like a clientele that will bring the neighborhood down.
Exactly. And that's exactly the way she was talking to me, was as though spiritual readings and, as she called it, fortune telling really should be regulated like bars or like strip clubs or like unsavory businesses like that. So to her, it made perfect sense that, of course, we wouldn't want this in this nice neighborhood.
Now, outside of this area, which is where I would imagine the majority of these New Age and occult and psychic businesses reside, how does that affect them?
I think it affects them exactly the way it affects me. I think it would take one person to basically call the city and say, hi, business X is engaging in readings or classes or whatever, Reiki services or chakra alignments or whatever. The city at that point, I think, would probably have to investigate, because there's probably some kind of a requirement internally that they investigate reports of violations. So they would probably have to go and investigate, and if they see that situation is happening and the business does not have whatever that special permitting license that they would require, if all they had was the retail license, they would be exactly in the same position that I'm in right now, which is they would, if the business has a retail license, they would allow them to continue to do retail activities, but not allow them to do anything else, and of course fine them, etc. But if they didn't have a retail license, then they would close down the business completely.
And this could go for any type of practitioner, even if you don't necessarily have a storefront, that somebody
Absolutely.
who does this as a service.
Absolutely.
There are some roving tarot readers who go to events.
Well, I believe the city of Chicago would require them to have a business license. I don't know how somebody gets a business license in the city legally from their home, because you're not supposed to do this kind of activity from your home. So honestly, that's a whole separate legal question that also needs to be addressed.
I haven't gone to a private tarot reader or palmist, but I mean, I've been living in the city my whole life. Mm-hmm. Many times I've rode by at night, and I could tell that the person who runs the business lives there.
That's correct.
It's
I think
it's an economical way to conduct it.
I think all it would take is for somebody to complain once. And the city would probably, if they investigated, they would find that business or practitioner in violation of the business licensing. And if they don't have any business license at all, they probably would be in even more trouble. They probably, they certainly would be told to stop. and I don't know what they would be fined. Now, in the city of Chicago, if you have an LLC or if you have some sort of a corporation, you can't appear in court, which you probably would have to do at that point, without an attorney. So something that, even if you went to court basically and said, okay, I won't do it anymore, you would still have to hire an attorney to do that, because the judges, they don't talk to you, they don't recognize you. If you're trying to represent an LLC or a corporation without an attorney present. So at the least, you're going to end up shelling out hundreds of dollars for attorney time while you're sitting in a courtroom and waiting for your turn. If you're an individual, you can represent yourself, from what I understand, but still, you may be assessed fines against, and who knows? I don't know what happens beyond that.
Now, would you say that this might actually be a religious argument? Because it makes me think of the New Life Church as one of our fairly new movements here in Chicago, and they seem to have branches everywhere. They have people on street corners, they have people in the subways, they set up shop in a public high school on the weekends, and they already have a lot of legitimate church sites, but I don't think anyone's going after them. So
if they're licensed perhaps as a church, maybe they're allowed to have their parishioners go out and spread the word. But, there's so much...
I'm still scratching my head about how they're allowed in a public school.
Good question. That's a whole different...
They do it on a Sunday, so it's not during school hours, but it's a school. It's a public school.
And mixing religion and state property is always interesting in itself, because, when it comes to mixing government and church in general, that's kind of a big question mark. Anyway, but a lot about this ordinance and a lot of the way that the zoning is being created and the way it's being enforced, which is very arbitrarily, really leaves a lot of room for the city to discriminate if it wants to. So, and as most of you guys probably know, since probably most of you experienced this in some shape or form in your life, pagans, New Agers, etc., are often discriminated against because, for lots of reasons, religious discrimination, of course, but besides that, just ignorance and so on and so forth. And so, without clear rules and some sort of a reasonable way of applying zoning, I believe we are as a community being discriminated against, essentially by the city officials and the way they treat astrology, palmistry, tarot cards, etc., whatever that category is. So, which is why I think it's so important that it be challenged. It has been challenged elsewhere. It needs to be challenged here. I believe this is an unreasonable way of zoning. I think this is a way the city basically it uses its zoning to zone out our kind of community and our kind of businesses and the services that we engage in and the services that we enjoy that are part of our religion and also part of our right of free speech.
I am very tempted to agree with you there. And you said it has been challenged successfully in other states.
That is my understanding. So initially, the challenges were mostly about whether or not people have the right to free speech in general when it comes to this kind of speech. And those have been successful in many, many areas. The last 25 or 30 years, most of the or a lot of the challenges have been about the way the cities zone and permit and the way that they organize these sort of activities in the city. For example, there was one case, I couldn't tell you what the name of it is, but there was one case that I read about where a city basically said, here, we're going to tax you $1,000 per year if you want to do readings in our city. That was struck down as unreasonable way of using permitting, for example, and the city lost in that case. It wasn't local, I think it was another state. Similarly, in other areas where they've had similar zoning ordinances that basically were unreasonable and overly burdensome to a business that was trying to get legal permitting to do the work that they do, they've lost. The cities have lost in those challenges as well. So I think if that's something that the community would want to do and pursue in court, I think there's a decent chance and a very good chance actually that the city would have to change its ordinance. And if it did, then we wouldn't have to worry about it being applied arbitrarily, basically at city's desire and whoever it is that's pushing the city's buttons to do it.
Now, this makes me think that it has much further implications than just your store owners as well. There's people who, as I said, they rove from event to event and do readings, and that's part of how they make their living. But the people who plan these events,
Absolutely.
there's a lot of people in the city who aren't necessarily store owners or business owners, but they're in the business of actually creating events that attract pagans and occult practitioners and enthusiasts, such as Greater Chicagoland Pagan Pride, and there's a number of others, much smaller ones, that do very good work for the city, throughout the city and beyond. And many of them are charity oriented. But now I think, are you saying that it's possible these events and these organizations, they can now suffer from this as well?
Well, let me ask you this. How many have you seen of them being actually in the city of Chicago?
Through my networking and where I come and go, I see it all the time. I just don't have the time or the money to attend them all.
Right. So it is I've never actually held an event in the state, so I don't know. I can tell you that in Washington State, if you wanted to have an event like that, you would need to have a permit from the city in order to do it. So I don't know if in the city of Chicago, if you get a permit, and you tell them that you will have readers and Reiki practitioners and so on and so forth at your fair, I don't know if you're going to be able to get that permit. They may just deny it, which means a lot of events, God knows. Over the years, I've seen lots and lots of events where they weren't organized in the legal sort of fashion, where they actually run it by the city. So that happens too. However, if somebody wanted to follow the letter of the law and actually go through the appropriate channels and do that in the city of Chicago, I don't know if I think it's unlikely that they're going to be able to get this permit unless they happen to be in that little area by the loop.
Or perhaps unless they deliberately keep out the pagan and metaphysical element.
Well, if it's a metaphysical fair, they're going to have to keep all the metaphysics out of the metaphysics. I don't know what will be left at that point.
Honestly, I think that opens the religious intolerance argument.
It certainly does. And that's the part of the freedom of religion through the First Amendment. It certainly brings that up. Now, in the legal research that I've seen, it seems like the freedom of speech is a stronger argument, and the zoning based on the freedom of speech is a stronger argument than the implications for the religions. However, I don't know if anyone's actually argued specifically freedom of religion in terms of the pagan community, as opposed to just, New Age community, let's say.
I haven't heard of, I happen to know of, let's say, I think it's on Wells Street and Chicago Avenue. There's a really big Christian goods store there where you can buy, candles and crosses and crucifixes and Bibles and all sorts of Christian themed items for your home, and that's fine if that's what you believe. But I don't hear of anybody going there and asking, okay, so where are you holding your prayer meetings?
That's correct, and that's exactly the difference. So I think the ignorance and the discrimination comes from the fact that to a pagan, what we call readings a lot of times is akin to having a prayer meeting.
It's the same mechanics
exactly.
If you know that much about it.
Exactly, but I don't think they do, and I think there's a systemic misunderstanding, ignorance, and honestly just discrimination, religious discrimination, that has to do with pagan practices. It hasn't been all that long since Wiccans and pagans have been recognized as an actual religion by the mainstream. And so I think we're dealing with those after effects from, Judeo-Christian traditions, basically starting maybe slowly to recognize pagans as a distinct group that is entitled to protection.
Well, I think it's a fair assessment to say that since the year 2000, the Christian right and the right wings in general have been gaining a certain amount of ground and taking away a lot of the advances that alternative religious culture has been gaining over the years.
There's certainly some of that. I can tell you that in the 90s, when I was getting into the pagan world and into the Wiccan world, even on the West Coast, there were still people who were getting in trouble for having practices in their home. They were being threatened to have their children taken away because they were exposed to pagan rites in the home. And we're not talking about something unsavory. There was nothing going on.
It's not like they were sacrificing children.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And there was no nudity or anything like that. But I personally know a few people in the 90s and early 2000s that were scared.
It does happen still. There's some bitter, I know of a couple of bitter divorces where the spouse decided, you know what, I'm going to try to bias the judge and the jury against my ex by saying that they practice pagan rites.
Sure.
in front of our child and trying to indoctrinate our child.
Sure, absolutely. I have certainly known people over the years that have been in that situation as well, certainly on the West Coast. And then, of course, lots and lots of people I know that until maybe the last 10 years or so, they don't tell their employers. They're afraid to tell and mention or wear any sort of regalia, pentacles, pentagrams, and the rest of it, that basically identifies them as pagans. So I think we have much, much work left, and we have much, much further to go in being recognized. However, in terms of this is what makes this ordinance and this zoning so important to be challenged. That's why it's so important the city is certainly entitled to zone. It's just it has to zone in a way that is actually reasonable and appropriate for everybody.
I totally agree. On that note, let's just take a quick break, and when we come back, we will continue and round up this discussion. And you are listening to Magick Radio Chicago, streaming live from 1680 AM and Q4.org, the station that creates beauty and defends it. And we're back, and you are listening to Magick Radio Chicago, streaming live from 1680 AM and Q4.org, the station that creates beauty and defends it. I'm your host, DK Prince, and I am having a discussion with Juliana of the Lady of Light, a New Age boutique. And we are discussing the alarming series of events that has recently befallen her store, and it should actually act as a wake-up call for the larger pagan community as a whole. Welcome back, Juliana.
Thank you.
Now, one of the things we were discussing during the break was we should first differentiate. Now, the city ordinance, or let's say the authorities who have contacted you, they presented themselves with the impression that they're seeking out fraud.
Right. So a lot of these zoning and bans and ordinances that have to do with protecting the public from the fraudulent practice of fortune telling really has roots in the fact that a lot of people believe that, or certainly believed when these ordinances were set in place, that the whole practice of astrology and tarot and etc. is actually fraudulent. For a long time. So on the West Coast, when I've heard about these kinds of things, I've always wondered how anybody could confuse a real reading, a real tarot reading, a real astrology reading, or intuitive reading, however you want to call it, with a fraudulent activity. However, since I've come to Chicago, I've been actually quite alarmed in my own right, because I have seen, I probably get about one person every 2 weeks, or maybe a couple of people every couple of weeks. Somebody will come in the store and they'll basically say, I went to the psychic ... place, and they told me that I could do a reading for $5, $10, $20. I sat down, and more or less immediately I was told that there's a curse on my family, or there's a curse that I will never meet anybody I love, or I won't be able to have relationships. And they could remove it or balance the chakras or whatever variation on the theme for a low price of $500 or $1,000 or $1,500. One person actually came in and told me that she was told by somebody out here in Chicago that she would basically that she was cursed into oblivion, and the only way that this was going to be resolved is if she signed up for a series of clearings for like $10,000 or something like that. It was an enormous amount of money, and obviously fraud.
Wow, that is like a really ballsy
yes, but that's
claim.
That's exactly it. And the girl was absolutely in tears. She sank down on my floor. She laid on my floor and cried. And then she asked me, is it real? Is it really true? Do you get that too? And my first question to her was, did you already pay the money? And she said, thankfully, she said, no, I wanted a second opinion. Because smart girl, at least she didn't hand it over. She looked young. She was probably in her early 20s, maybe late teens. And she looked like somebody that maybe would believe it, which I think is what made her, unfortunately, a victim of this sort of genuine fraud. Now, my answer to that is always, listen to your intuition. What does your intuition tell you? Does it pass the smell test? Can you tell the difference between somebody who's basically trying to take a lot of money off of you? And thankfully, in that case, she kind of listened to reason, and she checked in with herself, and she was able to realize that that's not a legitimate practice. So I think from the standpoint of the city, that's the kind of practice that they're trying to prevent. which is actually completely understandable.
And
just
it's not an original story either. I mean, I've
No.
heard this many times over the years.
Right.
There's all, I mean, and we're not knocking the pagan scene or the occult scene as a whole. We're saying that, well, people in general, we live in one of the biggest cities in the country. It's bound to happen. Sooner or later, there's going to be somebody who is trying to scam others.
Absolutely. And I think so on the West Coast, you saw that about 25 years ago when I just started. There were people who were engaged in a similar activity. But the more legitimate businesses and readers and functioning businesses there were in the Seattle area, the more these kinds of frauds got pushed out, because their clientele became more intelligent too in terms of what to expect and what a going rate was and what is and isn't actually real.
And I think one of the bonuses of having such a diverse pagan community and businesses is the fact that they do conduct classes that teach people to do their own readings.
Absolutely.
And they can learn to trust their own judgment through trial and error and networking and gathering information and just over the years learning to go with it. And that's a good thing. It's a noble
Absolutely.
thing.
And people are developing their own intuitions and they're learning how to check in with themselves. And that's very important. It's just unfortunate that I think the city kind of lumps everybody into that one same category, and they're trying to address an issue of fraud through zoning out legitimate businesses, potentially.
Now, one of the pet peeves that I've always had with any religious community is I'm against cults. I'm against coercion, brainwashing, manipulation, and I've seen on occasion some people who run businesses, they'll convince people that they might be cursed or they might be able to help them straighten their lives out, but in exchange they somehow wind up in this position of indentured servitude for X amount of time, that they just basically work for the shop for free just because.
Which actually brings up a whole other interesting area of law. I'll share something with you that happened to a friend of mine's shop about 10 years back.
Okay.
So they had students who, and these people are lovely, don't get me wrong. They really did not mean to do any harm whatsoever. But unfortunately it didn't work out well for them. So basically they had students that were working in their shop for free, volunteering their time. The IRS, when they got wind of that, actually fined the shop a ton of money because you apparently, from the standpoint of IRS, cannot volunteer at a business unless you're an intern connected with a school.
I imagine if it's a non. I imagine now if it's a legitimate temple with a tax exempt.
If it's a church,
right,
or a nonprofit, that's a different story.
Yeah.
Correct.
Then if it is not in the business of making profit, then clearly volunteers are
Absolutely.
welcome.
I believe that's an exception actually to the rule. This is applicable specifically to commercial businesses that pay regular taxes that are non-profits. And if it's not an intern who is actually engaged in with a school and actually legitimate business activities. But so that's a whole other area of how the law applies to all of this that is very interesting and different and oftentimes unexpected for business owners. So that's kind of an FYI as well.
Okay. Now, the thing that the city is doing right now, it's under the claim that they're trying to basically ferret out fraud, but
well, that's the background, certainly, to the legal
to the
cases.
Argument.
Yeah, to the argument going backwards. And this argument has been basically voiced, I believe, from at least 1911 on. This is how long this has been going on. The cities keep trying to basically under the guise of fraudulent activity, shut
all
down
the way back
any
to
kind
Victorian
of
times,
basically, yeah.
yeah.
So basically, from the time when people started doing spiritualism and trying to figure out how to raise the dead and how to talk to them in terms of mediumship to turn to people who have passed over, this has been going on basically for at least 100 years now.
Now that you bring that up, that does make me think of something. It's not quite as widespread as the Chicago pagan scene, but there is a metaphysical movement here in Chicago regarding spiritualism, regarding people looking for ghosts.
Well, if they're providing their services for a fee, this could potentially impact them too, I believe.
I mean, there are a lot of amateur ghost hunters.
if they're providing their service, so if somebody is paying them to provide this kind of a service, I don't know, that would be a very good question, but that I certainly would encourage those folks to take a look at some of the.
I suppose they could get away with it
legalities.
because they could say it's for scientific purposes.
Well, I don't know if that would be enough. If they charge the fee for it, I think that probably may be enough to get them in trouble already. So on the other hand, when I asked the city if classes or readings could be done for a donation, the city told me that if the service could not be done on the premises, even if it was being done for donations. So that would not pass muster either.
No, the city told you that.
The city told me that.
Oh, wow.
So the city
So
attorney told that to
not
my
even a
attorney.
donation basis.
That's what they told me, which sounds very interesting because I know a lot of businesses on both sides, West Coast and here, that do it for donations. According to this particular conversation,
Actually, that's pretty common.
yes, it is very common because a lot of people are trying to basically get around some of this, doing services for a fee. And I think in some cases it's helped people. But according to this round of conversations with the city, the city attorney told my attorney that I could not provide, for example, classes, and I could not provide readings on the premises, even for donations. As a matter of fact, I couldn't even go from my business and represent my business somewhere else for donations.
Like you couldn't go to an event.
For example, I couldn't rent a space somewhere in the city of Chicago and say that my business is doing a talk for a fee or for a donation. I could do it as a private individual for free, but that's where the line was.
I'm sure you probably might have heard of the famous ghost hunting team of Ed and Lorraine Warren. They're the ones that those movies, The Conjuring, are based on. That married couple, and they go around looking for ghosts. I personally don't agree with them or their tactics or their methods. But one thing that I know from seminars I've actually attended over the years, the last few decades, was that one of the things the Warrens did was whenever they were invited to any kind of seminar to discuss poltergeists and other types of ghost phenomenon, they would charge exorbitant fees just for showing up.
Interesting.
So I gotta wonder how that's going to affect people like that.
That's a good question. If they're doing it in the city of Chicago, gosh, I don't even know. But if I was in their position, I would want to double check and make sure that I was up and covered in that sort of a situation.
And I can see maybe charging a fee to create an event and do presentations for the sake of education and charge a fee at the door. I can even see that.
How would that be different than doing a class for
you see, that's,
presentation?
yeah.
You know what I mean? So
There you
you're
go.
relaying information, and that is free speech. So,
and relaying information that the mainstream religious right doesn't necessarily want to hear.
well, they certainly don't want to hear it, but besides that, I think they think it's intrinsically false and fraudulent. I think that's where that comes from, is basically, and they don't want other people to hear it and think it's real or true. And unfortunately, what's real to somebody who doesn't believe in any sort of occult or pagan type of information, obviously, their belief system differs from ours enough where to us one thing might be real and to them it may not be. So
Very true. Yep. So, and there are actually whole sects of fundamentalist Christianity that believe all ghostly phenomenon, no matter what it is, no matter what shape or form it is, it's always demons.
there's that too, yes. And so as a matter of fact, that brings back another story where
I'm sorry
go ahead,
to
sorry.
interrupt, but also to add to that, there are fundamentalist Christian groups that actually believe that even just meditation or even just the physical exercise of learning a martial art is in fact participating in Satanism on some level.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I talked to somebody who was a minister at a church who basically said even yoga.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Even yoga.
I've heard somebody get warned by their minister against taking Taibo classes.
I believe that. I have no doubt that there is a segment of population that believes that, as well as, I've heard somebody, talk about crystals as not just the fact that they didn't believe that they had powers and then they were inanimate objects, but they actually saw that as a gateway drug into Satanism and, spiritual abuse of individuals and the corruption of children and that whole thing.
Not even crystal meth, just
No, just the plain old crystals and rocks.
quartz crystals, the gateway drug.
That's right. So
You can't even just buy it because you think it looks pretty and it would look nice on your shelf.
there's some people that believe anything that has to do with New Age is by definition wrong and bad and dangerous to your soul.
Fair enough. Well, no, it's not fair enough. I'm saying fair that we've heard this argument quite a few times already.
Absolutely.
It's a shame. You'd think we'd evolved past that already.
I keep waiting for that to happen. But, the good news on that is when I started 26 years ago, the group I worked with was very much like, you can't talk about the things you're learning here. You can't discuss it with anyone. It's all secret. Hush, hush, do not disclose. Over the last 20 plus years that I've been around doing this kind of stuff, I've seen lots more people being awakened. I see a lot more people learning and talking. A lot of the information has come out and is available for people to learn, discuss, experience, that is available for people's spiritual
I think
growth.
it's changed the culture
Absolutely.
of the world as a whole. We're aware of a lot more things that shape our existence than we used to be.
And we live in a lot more levels, I think, than we used to. I mean, I can certainly say that from my own experience. When my eyes open to the spiritual world, every moment of my life I experience in multiple levels. And it is amazing, and it is so different than just experiencing the five senses.
Yes. I often describe on this show, actually, that, as I say every week, that the magical arts is a religious path.
Absolutely.
But I emphasize art. It's not the mission of my show to tell people what they're allowed to believe. Evangelism is just patronizing. What I tell them is look for the art in it. I don't care if you're a Muslim or if you read the Bible or if you're a Taoist or anything. Just look for the art in it, because the old school argument is that you don't get involved in a religious argument because it's just bad manners and it's just a fight waiting to happen and no one's ever wrong, and it's just it's a vicious circle that will never end. But I think they got to think about this. Why doesn't it end? Because neither side is wrong. Well, how is that possible? One say, a very literal thinking person might say, well, someone's got to be right and someone's got to be wrong. By definition, that's why you have an argument. Well, the only way that's possible is through the art of it. It's art. It's not math. It's not history. It's not law. It's
not exact.
No, it's a artistic platform that excites your imagination and excites your emotions. And when you tap into that, it makes you see your world very differently. It can even change you from the inside out. And from your perspective, whatever your religious leanings are, that is correct, because that is how, even religions that some people feel are unsavory or evil, they see something true in it. And maybe that's just where they are mentally at the time. But it only works from the artistic point of view. I don't believe that if you see the beatific image of God, that it's like, hi, how are you doing? I'm Joe God, how you doing? This isn't a magical business plan. This isn't, accounting. It's an artistic movement designed to change people's hearts.
Absolutely.
And it's unique to every individual, no matter how widespread the tradition. Everybody will see it from a different angle, and that angle will completely change them.
Well, one of my teachers a long time ago told me that while we were in the age of Pisces, someone stood between us and God and told us what to believe. Now that we're in the age of Aquarius, it's all about our direct connection to God and what we believe and create for ourselves. So I see religion as what works for you. Figure out what works for you, and then figure out the label to go with it, if you have to label it at all.
I know of certain groups that actually have the belief that you can liken the human race to the development of let's say a single person. In let's say the Bronze Age, that would have been or before the Bronze Age, that would have been when the god form was the mother. Mm-hmm. And agriculture and hunting and all that was necessary, and we really lived on the earth. We really owed all of our existence to whatever we could find off the land. and fertility and the natural cycles with the weather, and that was really a big part of who we were. Then at some point, humanity became more mechanized. Their thinking pattern became more complex, and they could start figuring out more tricky ways of doing things. And then you had the Bronze Age, and then you had philosophy, and that was the age of God as the Father. Mm-hmm. Now, as Grandpa Crowley has told us, we are now, as of some time back, we are now in the era. We are in the era of the crowned and conquering child. First we had the mother, then we had the father teach us. The mother is where we come from. Mm-hmm. That's who nurtures us and teaches our emotions and takes care of us. Then we, at some age, move on to the tutelage of our father, who teaches us the tools we need to survive and to fix things and to make things happen, for good and bad. Now we're at the age where, let's say, you were the child during that whole period, and now you've graduated college, you can balance your checkbook, you can drive a car, you can take care of yourself for the most part, and now, for good or bad, you are discovering who you are as an individual or as a singular person. The entire human race can be likened to this particular scheme, that now we are like stretching our wings out, and on our own, we're seeing what life has to offer, for good or bad. We're going to make our mistakes, but we have these lessons that the earth and the God the Father has taught us.
I love that, actually, because if you liken, it to astrology, then if we're in that moment of the child, the crowning child, being a Gemini, then the next step would be Cancer, or the empathy. So I keep waiting for humanity to grow, not just in its individuality, but it's in its ability to empathize with others, animals, humans. Maybe that's the age when wars will end, and we will actually be able to connect with others in an equal sort of way and feel what they feel, and maybe that'll be the golden age. I don't know.
Maybe. Or, or I like the Gnostic idea that basically the golden age is here and now at all moments. We just don't always see it. Now, to touch back on the topic of tonight's program, what is it that you feel that people in the Chicago pagan, metaphysical, and occult scene can do about this turn of events?
Well, I think in order for this sort of a challenge to be brought to the city's attention, I think there has to be a certain amount of unification amongst the pagan community and the pagan businesses in the Chicago area, or certainly in the city of Chicago. I think we kind of have to see if we're on the same page, if this is something that the community is interested in pursuing.
Now, there are some people who very correctly might say that's a lot easier said than done.
Absolutely. I agree. This is not an easy thing to do. This is a larger project, and certainly not a project that I want to take up on my own either. However, I think there's a lot to be gained from pursuing this project and from challenging this ordinance, if it is possible to be challenged. When I was at the courthouse and at the hearing, while I know that there were some other people impacted because I saw them, the courthouse is split up in several areas where while I know a few people that were involved, there were probably a lot of other people that received similar cease and desist letters that I'm not aware of. So I would be curious to hear if anybody else out there in the community has received this sort of thing from the city and has been impacted. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I would love to hear your stories, and I would love to hear kind of where we're at from a community standpoint. My email is theinnergoddess@yahoo.com, or please feel free to stop by the store. We're in East Lakeview, 3441 North Broadway. The Lady of Light is the name of the store.
And how can they reach you by phone?
My phone number is 206-605-1752. Please feel free to give me a call. We are closed on Sundays and Mondays, just an FYI. But I'm here Tuesday through Saturday, and it's me. So if you stop by the shop, you will definitely meet me in person.
Now, I'd like to emphasize the fact that this has happened to Juliana and her shop, but the way that this is carried out, the way that it seems to be handled by the city, basically applies to everybody who has an occult, new age, or metaphysical shop or business of any kind. If you're not within that one stretch just outside of downtown, it sounds like you're pretty much fair game.
Well, as far as I understand, from what I've seen, what I've heard, and what I've been told by the city, unless you are right in that area, in the downtown service area, right by the loop, and you don't have a special permit, and your business license from the city does not say something beyond a retail business license, you could potentially get called on just as easily as we were called on. So this is definitely something that you should be aware of. This is definitely something that you need to have a plan about, and maybe perhaps consult some sort of a legal service.
Now, this isn't just the concern of the pagan community either. There are a lot of grassroots city activist organizations that would be very interested in this kind of thing. These are concerns dealing with your religious freedom, with your freedom of speech,
First Amendment freedoms of all kinds.
And
Somebody started a wave. Drew and I were talking earlier. Somebody started a wave, and they may very well get swept up in it, but it seems like everybody else is getting swept up in it. And so this is definitely something that I think we need to take a look at from the community standpoint.
Not everybody in the community is going to get along, and we accept that, and we're not trying to make anybody into something that they're not. But what we'd like you to think about is the fact that all of us know people who have made their livings this way. All of us know people who have touched lives. All of us can be affected in the same way that the shop has been affected. And really, unless we show some kind of unity against this, there's not any way we're going to be able to change this ordinance. Now, I've actually networked with Phyllis Karat, who is a very famous pagan activist and lawyer. And what did she tell us about this situation?
Well, she, like several legal minds that I've talked to, have brought up the idea that this may very well be a violation of the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And she was definitely of the opinion of contacting ACLU and so on and so forth to get them on board with this. So that's something we're looking into currently.
Well, not just through the store, but also I'd like to volunteer Magick Radio Chicago, my format. If you are a member of the greater pagan community in Chicago, or even if you're not, if you're just concerned about this turn of events, I'd like you to feel free to contact me through my Facebook page, Magick Radio Chicago, or email me at magicradiochicago@gmail.com. Again, that's MAGICK radiochicago@gmail.com. I will be hosting a thread whereby I would like to bring together many prominent people and anyone in the Chicago pagan scene, occult scene, metaphysical scene, who is concerned by these turns of events and feels that this could affect them or their colleagues as well. I think that we could do a lot of good. Not all of us are going to get along, but I think we all have an interest in seeing this overturned. What do you think, Juliana?
I think absolutely. To many of you, I'm kind of a new person in the area, so I look forward to meeting all of you guys, and I do hope that you reach out to me or to
Would you
Drew.
be willing to host meetings here where we can
Absolutely.
just have a think tank discussion?
Absolutely, I would be happy to meet with whoever wants to meet in regards to this issue and hash it out. I would be happy to do that.
So as I mentioned a little earlier, so if you're interested in becoming involved in this, please feel free to contact us through magicradiochicago@gmail.com or through Facebook, and I will direct you to Juliana. Or you can contact Juliana through the Lady of Light, a New Age boutique. And again,
Let me give you the email address again. It's theinnergoddess@yahoo.com. Or my phone number is 206-605-1752. Or please feel free to stop by at the Lady of Light, 3441 North Broadway.
Right, now, as I've mentioned earlier, this is an alarming turn of events for pretty much every practitioner who's taken it upon themselves to make this their life's work, their life's business, their mission to help change lives. Some of them have been around for quite a while, and some of us who've been part of the pagan community know so many who have open their doors to people to help them, to discover their true selves.
Absolutely.
Their authentic selves, as they call it.
Absolutely.
There's any number of different categories that this ordinance could fall under: astrology, palm readers, tarot readers. Quite frankly, Reiki practitioners are very possibly the next target. Anybody who has some kind of business that is not considered mainstream could find themselves under fire. And as American citizens, I find that insulting. I find that oppressive. And I'm hoping so do you. Now, as I like to remind all of my listeners every week, that the magical path is in fact a religion. Just remember this: religion done right is art. So, look for the art in your lives and make your lives magical. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night, and thank you.